Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part 3 of the 4-part series where we cover the AimChess Rapid Finals tournament played between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley. Let's get right into it. This game was played with Magnus Carlsen having the white pieces and Wesley playing with black. We open up with e4 and we get a Sicilian. And if we quickly skim through the opening, we get into a Najdorf. Now, both of these players are well acquainted with the Najdorf. It's one of the most popular ways to play the Sicilian, and it's definitely one of the most solid. It's extremely difficult for white to obtain an advantage, and it leads to very, very complicated and very interesting games. And so for that reason, in this position where there are over 86,000 games in the database, Magnus Carlsen chooses to play the 8th most popular move with only 2,000 games played, which is a4. The point of a4 is pretty simple. It's to prevent b5, but ultimately it's also to sometimes play a5 himself and then jump the knight into a4 and plays knight to b5, where it controls a large portion of the queen side. We get knight c6, once again, from this position where there are over 400 games. Magnus Carlsen chooses to take this knight, which has only been played 8 times. And the point of this is to just get Wesley out of his theory, even though these are technically slightly inaccurate moves, which give black a very solid position and maybe even a slight edge. This is a rapid game where a lot of inaccuracies and mistakes are very easy to make, and therefore Magnus Carlsen wants to create some sort of imbalance and force Wesley to spend a lot of time thinking. Wesley recaptures the knight, and we get a5, once again with the same idea. There's no b-pawn which can potentially target this pawn, and it's very difficult for the knight to get attacked if it were to be on b6, so therefore this is a very nice square for the pawn. And even if the knight never goes to b6, it's just nice to control this b6 square with the pawn, so to take up more space on the queen side. We get e6. This is very popular in the Sicilian, to play e6 and d6, and then to prepare d5. Obviously, black would like to solidify his center and get rid of all these weaknesses, so d5 is next on Wesley's bucket list. We get bishop d3, which just supports the e4 pawn, and d5 unrolls. Here, Magnus Carlsen castles. Let me quickly explain why Magnus Carlsen did not take this pawn. So if this capture occurs, what we see afterwards is that black has an entirely solid center with 2 central pawns, whereas white has no center pawns. And even though technically an engine could probably draw this game, playing this as a human is extremely difficult, as it is very hard to undermine these pawns. You'd have to move this knight somewhere and prepare c4. And just playing against this would be very difficult since these pawns would be marching down the board. So after Magnus Carlsen castles, Wesley plays bishop e7. And once again, Wesley did not take this pawn because this would create an isolated pawn on c6. And it would ruin pretty much his entire pawn structure, since after, let's say, these captures occurred, we can see that this pawn on c6 is very weak. This bishop has no way of developing itself because it would just be staring into its own pawn. And on d7, it's extremely passive. This e6 pawn is more of an obstacle than it is anything else, especially since there's no d4 pawn, because usually in IQT positions, having a pawn on e6 or c6 is beneficial since it prevents d5. However, here there's no d pawn that can get pushed, so therefore these 2 pawns would be meaningless and would serve as targets for white. So obviously that did not happen. And we get bishop e7, rook e1, bringing another piece to the game, black castles, and we get bishop f4. Now, the point of bishop f4 is to just serve as a very nice piece, which controls a lot of these dark squares. And so after bishop b7, which is actually a very interesting move. So bishop b7 may seem as a very useless move since this bishop does not see anything besides its own pawns. But if we just think about the future prospects of these pawns, it's very likely that these pawns would jump down to d4 and then black would solidify with c5, and from there the bishop would be open and would have actually a very, very strong piece. So therefore, this is a very nice move, even though you have to, kind of calculate down the line a little bit just to see its true purpose. We get e5, kicking the knight out. Ultimately, this move has its own concession in the fact that this bishop, it no longer, sees any of these dark squares, no longer controls them. Right now, it's just staring into its own pawn. And Magnus Carlsen plays rook e3. The point of rook e3 is to create a kingside attack. Now that the center is sort of closed, it's very easy to recruit all of these pieces and start marching down this h-file, create some sort of queen h5 threat. With both of these bishops staring down these files, it can become very powerful very quickly if Wesley does not respond properly. g6 is played, and the point is that if, let's say, a random move is played, like rook c, for example, actually right away, this sacrifice would be completely possible, because after this capture, there would be rook h3 check, and then queen h5, and this would be kind of difficult to defend. Instead, Wesley opts in to play g6, which prevents any of that. And after rook h3, we get sort of the idea of this position. But here it's quite difficult since these light squares block a lot of the squares that Magnus Carlsen would like to access. For example, this bishop is very obsolete in this position because it doesn't threaten anything and it's not able to sacrifice itself since these pawns are very well reinforced. And this queen cannot jump into h5 since there's a pawn preventing that. So g6, once again, a very nice defensive move by Wesley So. And then he plays f5. And this is a very, very hard move to spot because it allows en passant, which gets played by Magnus Carlsen. And I'm sure every single member of r/Anarchy Chess is ecstatic right now. But the point of f5 is that if en passant happens, which it does, black can recapture with the rook, and suddenly this position is very hard to access for white. There are no targets, and actually black is the one leading the attack. For example, queen f8 creates some sort of problems on the f2 file. And if white decides to not take en passant and, let's say, plays a different developing move, now this bishop is completely stuck. It has no sort of targets whatsoever. This pawn structure is very solid, and it's very difficult to break through. And therefore, this game wouldn't really have any sort of attack, especially since f5 takes up a lot of space and it controls all of these light squares. So Magnus Carlsen would be in a very unpleasant position had he played queen f3. After en passant happens and the rook recaptures, we get queen g4, trying to create some sort of counterplay, maybe with rook g3 and applying more pressure down this file. We get e5, taking up more space. Bishop h6 gets played. Bishop h6 is a nice resource if the rook was on f8. Currently, the rook is not on f8, so the bishop on h6 really doesn't serve much purpose, besides the fact that it's probably safer on h6 than it would be on, let's say, e4, or e3, sorry, where it would get forked by the move d4. But regardless, Wesley So plays bishop c8, and the point is that the knight wants to move, and from there, this would create an x-ray attack on the queen and rook, so Magnus Carlsen will lose material if he kept this. So instead, he plays rook g3. The point of rook g3 is to get out of the x-ray, but also to, once again, create some sort of pressure on this g-file, maybe kick this rook out, and then potentially a bishop sacrifice would be pretty nice. We get knight c5 anyway, which targets the queen, so now the queen is forced to retreat back, and now we can see that once this dust has settled, there's really no attack going for Magnus Carlsen at this very moment, and instead, Wesley So has much greater center control, he has very active piece play, and he's the one actually leading this attack. So very interesting turn of events. He plays rook b8, purpose is to attack this b2 pawn, and also to activate his rook on this b file, since currently the a file, well, it's pretty shut. We get bishop g5 out of Magnus, attacking this rook, and here the point is that after the straight has occurred, maybe it wasn't the best straight that could happen, but currently we understand that Magnus's pieces are far less active, they're more passive, and therefore by trading off Wesley So's more active pieces, the game gets closer and closer to equal. So for example, this position was almost -2. After the bishop trade has occurred, it's down to -1. Slowly but surely, Magnus is trying to get to equality in order to secure potential draw. We get queen c1. The point is to protect this b2 pawn and also enable the potential queen h6 maneuvers. And Wesley So plays rook f6, applying more pressure down this f file and creating potential attacks with queen f7, for example. We get knight a4 in an attempt to trade off as many pieces as possible in order to get a very equal position, since even though his position would be slightly less active with no piece on the board, it's very difficult to punish that, especially in the rapid game. And e5 is played. e5 is a very nice move because it takes up even more space in the center. It forces Magnus into a very, very passive position with his bishop being on f1. We can see from here that Wesley So's pieces are far better placed. He has potential to create a pass pawn in the center. This knight trade occurs, and Wesley So plays queen to f8, once again applying pressure down the f2 pawn, so this pawn is currently hanging since there are two pieces attacking it and only the king defending it. That is why Magnus Carlsen plays f3. But the problem with f3 is that even though it does get rid of the weakness of the pawn on f2, it also opens up these dark squares, and it creates weaknesses along this diagonal. So afterwards, Wesley So spots that and plays queen c5 check, forcing the king to go h1, and then he plays queen f2. Queen f2 is a very nice move because if Magnus Carlsen captures his pawn, he can sacrifice his queen and checkmate Magnus Carlsen. And pretty much no matter what Magnus Carlsen plays here, he's going to lose a pawn. So what happens is rook a1. The point is to, prevent these backrank opportunities. And then he just takes his pawn very calmly, trades off more pieces. And now he's up a pawn in a very, very nice endgame where he's more active and he's winning. The engine evaluates this as a little over -2.5. We get bishop g2, just attacking the queen, developing the piece. The queen retreats. And we get c3. Opening up the position a little bit, preventing the attack, which was caused by queen f6, which was staring down this b2 pawn. So c3 prevents that. Now here it's important to know that both players are on very, very low time, so they're mostly just maneuvering their piece around, trying to get a slightly better position. There isn't that much to say about these moves. For example, the next couple of moves, Magnus just gets offered a trade, and he probably should have taken it. But regardless, we just see some pieces maneuver. Finally, we get b4, solidifying this pawn structure. c3 is a backwards pawn though, so Magnus Carlsen should be careful with that. King g7, activating the king. We get bishop f1, but it also attacks this pawn. Rook f8, the pieces shuffled back. I think at this point that Magnus Carlsen was so low on time, he just wanted to play moves very quickly in order to gain some time back, which would allow him to think. But with both players very low on time, it's very difficult to make progress in this position. However, if anybody has winning chances, then it is Wesley So. We go a couple of more moves, and Magnus blunders a pawn with the move c4. Now, the point of c4 is, if this capture was to occur, this bishop would be hanging, since it's the only piece besides the queen which protects the bishop, and there are two attackers from the white's perspective. But Wesley So recognizes that and instead takes his pawn, and we get a completely winning position for Wesley So. Magnus plays rook c3, and once again, I'm kind of skimming over these last, 10, 15 moves just because there isn't that much thought put behind them. Rather, they were played on intuition since the time was really low and players were just trying to survive without getting flagged. Queen goes to f6, we get rook c7 check, the king slides over to h5, queen e3 check, and here Wesley So should have played queen to f4 because this would have saved the position, and white would no longer have any more checks available. That wouldn't sacrifice any pieces. But instead, he plays g5, which allowed the crazy move to be played, which was queen b6. And queen b6 forces a trade of queens. So for example, after this, now white has a passed pawn that's only 2 squares away from promotion. And the square that it would promote on is not on the same color as this bishop. So preventing it would be very difficult. And this position actually evaluated much better for white because, well, white gets a queen. Unfortunately, Magnus doesn't spot that. He plays rook b7 with an attempt to play rook b6, which would pin the queen to the king. However, Wesley So spots that and plays the beautiful queen a1 check, forcing the king to f2, and after rook h2, Magnus Carlsen resigned. The point is that this bishop cannot move because it's pinned to the king, and there's absolutely zero way to protect it. You cannot protect it with your king because, let's just say this, you get this check, and, well, it's a rook versus queen endgame in which Wesley So would be completely winning, and even with low time, Wesley So would definitely be able to convert this position. And I think with Magnus playing unconventional moves and, trying to get out of theory, it really just made him a little bit worse, and it allowed Wesley So to just completely capitalize on that and play just a very beautiful game. That sums up Game 3. I would say that the biggest theme in this game was just active piece play and the positioning of one's pawns. For example, the material was equal for the majority of the game, but we saw just how suffocated Magnus felt in this position and how Wesley So was able to capitalize off of those weaknesses. And that sums everything up I wanted to show you guys for this game. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you learned something new, and I hope to see you in a future video.